So right off the bat, I know that this entire intro is going to sound pretty biased because my big opener is that the Steam Deck is pretty great. And what I mean by that is that modern games run pretty well in most cases, slightly older games run exceptionally well with a great balance of power to performance, and really old or slightly obscure stuff can either be run directly on the Steam Deck or emulated with relative ease. So if I'm going to sit here and just sing the praises of the Steam Deck and talk about how incredibly flexible it is, again being a veritable Swiss Army knife of a gaming machine, then why do I still keep a gaming rig, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo console around at all? Well, that's what I wanted to talk about today, because despite my love for the Steam Deck, there are a ton of games, or rather I should say types of games, that I just won't play on it. Now, let me provide a little bit of context to that, because when I say that I will never play it on the Steam Deck, I don't necessarily mean purely like flat out absolutely never ever, because obviously if I'm making a video about a particular game, of course I'm going to play it on the Steam Deck, and I have no qualms about doing that. Rather, what I'm referring to are types of games that I just really don't play myself when it comes down to just playing the Steam Deck for fun, and not when I'm playing it in the capacity of actually producing videos for here on the channel. I should also point out that something else that really drives a lot of the types of games that I'm going to illustrate in this video is specifically how I play the Steam Deck, which for me is almost 100% of the time in handheld mode. And when I'm not playing it in handheld mode, I'm playing it in docked mode, but really just so I can capture footage for making videos. By and large, if I'm just playing games for myself to have fun, it's almost always sitting on my couch and just playing it as a handheld. Now, I'll be the first to admit some of my reasons are stupidly subjective here, although I will say that other reasons that I provided here I think may be fairly universal in terms of a determining factor why somebody would not want to play a game on the Steam Deck. So all that being said, let's just go ahead and start with the first type of game that I will not play, and those type of games would be modern, just super immersive, visually stunning AAA games. And that's the thing, a lot of big beefy AAA graphical stunners can look really good on the Steam Deck, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to. Typically this involves some sacrifice either to frame rate, resolution, visual effects, or some combination thereof to really get a great experience when you play these types of games on the deck. Now, an example of some of the games that fit this mold for me personally, again, games that I personally love but will not play on the Steam Deck for the most part, would be games like Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, Days Gone, what else am I missing here? Hogwarts Legacy, Spider-Man, any of those games that really have just like top tier visual effects and are fairly modern for the most part. I know Spider-Man might be a little bit long in the tooth right now, but Hogwarts Legacy definitely isn't, and that is a hard game to get to run really, really well on the Steam Deck. And again, all of these are games that I personally absolutely love, I'm just not playing them on the Steam Deck unless it's an extremely short burst or if I have a specific reason for doing so, when I have the ability to play it in much greater visual fidelity on my gaming rig with an ultra-wide monitor. And again, I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with playing a few missions in Red Dead Redemption 2 on your Steam Deck, or just farming a little bit in the lands between in Elden Ring. I'll just say that whenever I'm sitting at my desk, if I have the Steam Deck to my right and my gaming rig on my left, I'm probably going to pick the gaming rig every time for an experience like that, because I know that's where I'm going to get the best experience, at least visually speaking. And speaking of my desktop gaming rig, that's also the primary reason that I tend to completely ignore this next type of game on the Steam Deck, and that would be games that require, a mouse and keyboard to really take full advantage of, or otherwise just sport an overly dense control scheme to enjoy. And the big reason for that is, even though I respect the inclusion of the touchpads on the Steam Deck, and they're incredibly helpful whenever I need to navigate menus or do something that kind of requires a brief jaunt into the territory of the desktop operating system that it uses, by and large, I just don't like using them for any sort of gameplay. One example in particular that I can think of that just did not work well with that control scheme and was much better when I actually had a mouse at my disposal would have been Puss, which is a surrealist cat game where you guide a cat through a series of complicated mazes, but in order to do so, you have to hold down the left mouse button and continually move the cat around, which is not something that you can easily do with the trackpads on the Steam Deck. And while that's a fairly lightweight and admittedly weird kind of example, there are a lot of games that I discovered on the Steam Deck once it finally allowed me to play PC games again, but I found just did not work very well in handheld mode, and in turn left me looking to either play the Steam Deck in docked mode, or just turn entirely again to a gaming rig like I already mentioned, and that would include games like Valheim, V Rising, Command & Conquer, or again, really any game that sports an overly complicated control scheme that really benefits from putting the controller aside and just adopting a mouse and keyboard entirely. Now granted, there are plenty of games that try to make sure that both keyboard and mouse and the controller are completely viable to play them, but I've also found that in a lot of situations there are games that, despite their best efforts to provide both options to players, you usually find that the keyboard and mouse is still the better way to go, just because despite the comfort and simplicity of a controller, it just doesn't really match the raw precision and flexibility that you get from having all of those keys at your disposal and a mouse. The most recent or prevalent example of this that I can think of would be playing Baldur's Gate 3. Initially I did play this on the Steam Deck, but ultimately I really do prefer playing it on my desktop PC, where I might use the controller predominantly, but every now and then if I need to rearrange my inventory or where spells are located or just do something with my action bar, it's a lot easier to perform those actions with a mouse and keyboard, and that's just really my optimal place to play a game like that. And speaking of Baldur's Gate 3, that brings me to the next type of game that I tend to ignore on the Steam Deck or not indulge very often, and that would be multiplayer games. Now, to be fair, I've only indulged multiplayer on the Steam Deck a few different times, and that would have been for games like Left 4 Dead, Phasmophobia, Diablo 4, Baldur's Gate 3 obviously, and Dead by Daylight I would say most recently. And while it was novel to play multiplayer PC games on my couch in handheld mode, it wasn't the best experience for a couple of reasons. The first would have been actually trying to manage voice communications using the Steam Deck. Specifically, I did run into some issues when I was trying to use voice chat within Phasmophobia, but then I also had a few other games where, despite the fact that I definitely had my headset selected as the audio source that I was using for my mic and my output, I couldn't get it to work properly with the game, and that kind of left me in a weird position where I was awkwardly scrambling to get comms to work when all my other friends who were playing on PC were getting along just fine. The other piece of that was I didn't really have a great way to load Discord onto the Steam Deck. I'm sure there is a native app for it somewhere and there's a way to make that work, but I just hadn't done it yet at the time, and I just ended up using Discord on my phone, which kind of meant I didn't have the best audio experience since I couldn't really listen to my phone with my headset and also listen to the Steam Deck very well. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that I just really didn't want to mess with multiplayer that much when it came to the Steam Deck. And then outside the issue of comms, there's also the concern of making sure that you have enough battery life if you're playing in handheld and you want to jump into a multiplayer game, which kind of goes hand in hand with performance. Pound for pound, I think I'd rather just fire up my Xbox and have things like Xbox Live Party Chat and the visual performance of the game and have all of that stuff just immediately streamlined and ready to go for extended sessions with friends. Now, I wouldn't mind just jumping on the Steam Deck for a couple of rounds of Dead by Daylight with randos here and there, but again, if I'm looking to play for an extended period of time with friends and I just want to have a very stable base to play from, I would again want to play either on my gaming rig or, on one of my consoles, which has really robust and reliable comms, and again, I don't have to worry about performance or battery life or anything like that. Again, we're talking about the way I play it, which is predominantly handheld mode. And speaking of the Xbox, that brings me to the final weirdly specific type of game that I don't really like to play on the Steam Deck, and that would be any post-6th generation emulated console games. Now, I know there are provisions for emulating systems as recently released as the Nintendo Switch, and Lord knows that personally I've emulated everything from the original Game Boy all the way up to the Dreamcast, but anything right about that Dreamcast/6th generation console level and beyond, I just haven't decided to bother with yet. And that's for a few different reasons. One is that the 6th generation of consoles seems to be about the cutoff from where you have really wide-scale, reliable emulation. Like, I've flirted with PS3 emulation before, but honestly the ease with which you can emulate something like Super Nintendo games versus how hard it is to emulate a PS3 or an Xbox 360 game is quite the leap in my experience. And even though it is technically possible and I've seen people run these games reliably before, I personally don't want to put in that much effort just to have that experience, especially when I'm still very much a console player and collector and would typically just prefer to play those games on the original hardware since I do have it at my disposal. Not to mention the more recent the game, then the larger those file sizes are going to be, and at a certain point it just doesn't become that practical to keep a massive library of PS3 games available and at the ready on my Steam Deck, when I do have a PS3 that I could just walk over to and pop in some of my favorite games and play whenever I feel like it. Now don't get me wrong, I think it's incredibly novel, technically impressive, and honestly kind of hilarious that you can play Nintendo Switch games on the Steam Deck, but by and large for me, anything post-GameCube era I would just prefer to play on original hardware for the most part. And honestly, who knows, maybe one day my tastes will change in that arena and I will get into more modern emulation a lot more heavily, but as it stands, at least at this exact moment in time, I think between those first 5 console generations and whatever I can load up natively on the Steam Deck, I think I'm doing okay for the moment. Alright, so I think that's it for this one. I tried to sit down and think of any other just, sort of categories or types of games that I don't immediately want to play on the Steam Deck for some reason or another, but hey, what about you? Are there any specific games or just, broad categories of games like I've outlined here that you personally don't play on the Steam Deck either? If so, I would love to hear your thoughts on it below. As always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel and your viewership. It means a lot to me. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.